Kerry. I understand the next witness is Professor Fong. Some details of his evidence may well be distressing, not only probably to the witness himself, but also to those who are following our proceedings. We expect it to contain descriptions of end-of-life care and the management of those who died. So those in the hearing room who feel they would be too distressed, please leave now. And those who are watching online, if you wish to do so, please pause the live stream.
Yes, thank you very much, my lady. May I invite now, please, Professor Fong to be sworn.
I do solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Professor Fong, your full name, please.
I am Kevin Fong.
You are a doctor employed by University College London Hospitals NHS Trust as a consultant anaesthetist, is that right?
That is correct.
And you also work as a helicopter emergency medical service doctor for the air ambulance charity in Kent, Surrey and Sussex.
That is correct.
And I think you have had a dual specialist accreditation in anaesthesia and intensive care medicine, and you've been in practice now for some 26 years.
That is correct.
All right. During the pandemic, is this right, you were seconded to NHS England's as a national clinical advisor to the Emergency Preparedness, Resilience and Response Corps, EPRR, as we've been referring to it. And it's about that I'd like to ask you some questions. I think also, though, as well as working in the EPRR capacity, you took on clinical roles, including clinical shifts at UCLH, and indeed in critical care transfers from one hospital to another throughout the southeast of England. Was that by road and air?
By road and air, yes.
And the questions I want to ask you this morning really focus on your role in what are called peer support visits for intensive care units. And I think you say in your statement that you were responsible for organising and leading a programme of visits into hospitals that were experiencing severe pressure during the pandemic. This was across England, is that right?
That is correct, yes.
And how long did the visits programme last?
So formally, the programme ran from around summer 2020 all the way through until July 2021, when administrative support was ceased. They continued in other forms after that, but that was the formal programme.
And over the course of that period, how many visits did you personally undertake?
I personally led and undertook more than 40. I lost count.
All right. I think the visits had their genesis, is this right, when you received a message in March 2020 from a colleague at a district general hospital that was experiencing a significant surge. So can we start there, please, Professor? And just tell me, what did the clinician tell you about what was going on in their hospital?
So at that time, I was aware that they were experiencing pressure when I contacted one of the clinicians working on the shop floor. They told me that their ICU was full, that they were overflowing with patients, that they were running out of staff, that they were running out of basic consumable items, and that included drugs, equipment, that they were raiding their resuscitation trolleys, which are the trolleys that you usually keep for cardiopulmonary resuscitation if someone has a cardiac arrest, for things like very basic items like bougies.
What's a bougie?
A bougie is a kind of flexible stick that you use to help intubate a patient, to place a tube into their windpipe to help them breathe and establish them on a ventilator. They were raiding the trolleys for those items. They're very basic items, and for endotracheal tubes that you would place in the windpipe to establish them on a ventilator.
Were you surprised to learn that they were running out of such basic equipment?
It was very early in the pandemic. It was quite a shocking account. I was surprised at the scale of the pressure they were facing, and that the data had not captured that.
Right. Well, I was going to ask you that, and I ought to have introduced your statement, which ends 474327. I think you have a copy in front of you, Professor, if you need it. But you said there that what you'd learnt really appeared to be, your words, at odds with the data reports. What was the data telling you that was such at odds with what this hospital was telling you?
The data, it was more that the data did not paint the picture of that severity of pressure out of basic equipment, out of staff, insufficient staff to staff transfers out to decompress your facility. And I felt that there was a gap between what we could understand by seeing numbers on screens and what was actually happening when you spoke to the people on the ground.
I think you said that clinician told you that they had insufficient intensive care and anaesthetic medical staff to be able to transfer patients out.
That is correct.
Given that you've been involved in transfers out, how many doctors and nurses does it take to conduct a transfer from one ICU to another?
So it's a specialist skill. You usually require at least one specialist intensive care nurse and an intensive care doctor or anaesthetist who is specially trained to conduct these. They're not without risk. They're difficult to do. There's risk to the patient. There's risk to the staff.
Right. And in short, were you invited then to come and see what it was like in the hospital?
At that time, no. At that time, it was just the realization that perhaps there was a gap between the data and the information and the insight. Data isn't information, information isn't insight. And given that so much of this depended upon understanding how much capacity there was in the system, I identified that as a problem.
Can I ask you about your first visit, please? And I think you deal with this starting at your paragraph 15 in your statement. And I think you talk there about visiting one of what you describe as the UK's hardest hit hospitals for ICU COVID admissions relative to baseline critical care capacity. Can you just put that into layman's speak for us?
Yes. So on this occasion, I was aware that this hospital was already under pressure. I had contacted them. And I said, please tell me what's going on. And in the end, the clinical lead, who I knew personally, said, it's much easier if you come and see it. When I talk about baseline capacity, that's the number of beds that unit would have had pre-COVID. And that's important because it determines the number of staff available to run that bed. An ICU bed is not a piece of furniture. It requires a specialist staff around it of many people.
And so this was an informal visit as a result of the offer, effectively, from the clinician that you knew. Is that correct?
It was. It occurred to me that it might be useful to be able to see that for myself. And so I did indeed, I think, one Sunday afternoon visit that unit.
And you say this was a hospital where a catchment area featured pockets of significant social deprivation, as well as Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities who we know were at increased risk of severe COVID if infected. So could you tell us, please, what you saw on that first visit?
Yeah, it was very memorable. I was greeted at the entrance by one of the intensive care registrars. I asked him immediately what things had been like. He replied, I'll never forget, he replied, it's been like a terrorist attack every day since this started, and we don't know when the attacks are going to stop. And I remember thinking that's, for them, that wasn't a hyperbolic statement. They'd admitted an average of 8 intensive care patients per day during the whole of that period. We went into the hospital. Their oxygen panel alarms, so the panels that show you the state of their oxygen supply, were alarming constantly. They led me down to an ad hoc intensive care areas. Their intensive care areas were already full, so their baseline was already full, and they'd spilt out into their operating theatres.
This is, I think, April 2020.
That is correct.
Can you give us an idea of what's the noise like in an ICU when the oxygen is under stress? There are obviously other pieces of equipment. I just want to try and get a sense of what it was actually like.
So it's difficult to remember precisely what I was hearing. Intensive care units are noisy at the best of times, but they led me through this, I guess, this plastic airlock that they'd assembled with a zip and you know, between the clean areas and the COVID areas. The operating theatres recovery was just like nothing I'd ever seen. An intensive care bed is supposed to have about 20 to 25 square metres. It's the size of a very large living room.
Pick something in our hearing centre. Give us an idea.
It would probably be from here to that desk, to Milady's desk, and about that width. That's about 5 metres by 5 metres, should be what it should be. The beds were stacked in here so tightly that I had to squeeze between them. The patients were close enough that they would have been able to hold hands. The equipment was wedged between them. This looked like a unit that was in real trouble. It had already taken on its full intensive care unit capacity. It was in the ad hoc areas. It was in its theatres recovery, and the nurses were nursing at a ratio of as low as 1 to 6, actually, at that time. 1 specialist intensive care nurse to 6 intubated, ventilated patients.
Can you help us? How long did you spend at this hospital, and then we'll widen it to the other visits that you conducted? How long were you there for?
So this was an afternoon's visit where I had a look around at all of the different areas, and I think this... I talked to the staff on the shop floor, many of whom were already in tears, and I realised at this point that perhaps it would be better if we were able to do this ourselves and see these areas to understand what they were going through.
What were the nurses telling you?
They were telling us that they couldn't operate at this level. These diluted ratios with 1 specialist ICU nurse covering 4 or 6 patients at a time. I remember in another hospital, the nurse is telling me that all you have time to do is to manage the alarms. You're not managing the patients. The alarms are going off constantly. The syringe drivers, the ventilators, the beds, whatever. You've got the oxygen, and you're putting out fires rather than caring for the patient.
When you came away from that visit, what did you resolve or decide to do?
I think it's reinforced my sense that there was a gap between what the data could tell us and what we could understand by talking to people or actually being there. I think the data were important and necessary, but they weren't sufficient alone to give us a good picture of what the state of compensation or decompensation of these units was. And so after that, I felt that we had to have mechanisms that would better inform us, to give us the information, to give us the insight.
And I think you say in your statement that acute hospitals have to complete a return on a daily basis with their data. And you say that's an onerous task. And you make this observation that the quality and completeness of the data return reduced when the unit was under severe operational stress, and what presumably, therefore, you had the best data from those hospitals that weren't under that degree of pressure.
That's correct. The data collection forms at first were incredibly onerous, so much so that the nursing staff who were already pressured were coming in their spare time to complete them and return them. And it was clear, we plotted the data, it was clear that those units under the most stress provided the poorest data returns, and indeed until the point that they became so operationally stressed that they provided no returns at all. So those that you wanted to know the most about were least likely to return in the first wave.
Can we be clear, the data return, is that a requirement placed on them by NHSE? We've also heard about ICNARC data, and I just want to be clear about who requires this data to be provided.
So those data sets are separate, but there was a requirement centrally from NHS England or the regions, in addition to the ICNARC data, which is routinely collected for, I think, all the units now.
Okay, all right. You decided then that there needed to be this programme set up, and I think you say that the visiting team, either you and or the rest of your colleagues going on them, would comprise up to 4 doctors and nurses drawn from a unit of a similar size and scope in another region. And just tell us now, over the course of your 40-plus visits, how long were you at the ICUs for?
So each visit, we would turn up, depending on geographically where they were, as early as we could in the morning. That was usually, practically speaking, 9 or 10 o'clock in the morning. We would stay for a full day. It was important that this wouldn't be a cursory flyby of a visit. It was important that we had time to embed with them, to put on PPE, to get onto the shop floor with their people on their units, and then to spend the back half of the day in conversation. So that would be 4 or 5 hours of conversation afterwards with whoever would talk to us.
Right. And when you spoke to the staff, what kind of roles were they performing? What levels of staff did you speak to?
So we made the offer open to the unit we were visiting. Sometimes we would only talk to the doctors and nurses. Sometimes they would give us everybody. We would talk to the doctors, the nurses, the allied healthcare professionals as well, the occupational therapists, the dietitians, the physiotherapists, all of these people who are required to run an intensive care unit, healthcare assistants. It was really up to the unit how they wanted to use us as a resource.
Did you ever speak to any non-clinical staff during your visits?
So if by non-clinical staff we mean neither doctors nor nurses, then yes, as I mentioned, the allied healthcare professionals who are also clinically active, healthcare assistants. I think at 1 or 2 hospitals we did speak to some of the porters and some of the cleaning staff.
May I ask you this? What was the sort of purpose of going in and visiting these hospitals? What was the aim?
It was twofold. First and foremost, it was provide support for these people. We designed them very carefully. It took effort to design these visits. They were informal. They were peers. So we would take doctors and nurses from similarly sized hospitals from another region in to see a mirror image of themselves elsewhere, so that it would encourage discussion and sharing of information. So the first and foremost role was to provide support for these people, for that allow them to spend some time reflecting and with us and learning, if there were different ways to do things. And then secondarily, it was to try and close this gap between information, data information and insight, and so that I could go back to the emergency preparedness, resilience and response team and report in and give an accurate picture of what we were dealing with.
Sorry to interrupt, can I just go back to the data gap, Professor Fong? Presumably, if you have that gap, what you were hearing and seeing is dismissed as anecdotal because the data's not showing it.
That
maybe
is
considered. Dismissed may be too pejorative a word, but
yes, there is understandably, this value that we attribute to stuff that you can count, but in the famous words, not everything that counts can be counted. And for me, if we were talking about the capacity available in these units, then we had to understand this anecdotal picture, it's a complex assessment of a complex system, and that's why I was taking the teams in. The doctors and nurses who came with me are system experts. They are able to see with their own eyes and have an assessment of what is happening.
I think you said you spent more than 400 hours during the course of your visits in conversation with the frontline teams. Are you aware whether there were any similar visits or programmes run in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland?
I was contacted by representatives from several of the other nations. We were NHS England, and so my role was an NHS England role, and the programme was an NHS England programme. We were unable to offer visits outside of England at that time. We discussed with the 4 nations what we were doing. We had requests, but we didn't have the resource to fulfil them, and I am not aware of any similar programme in the other nations.
And can I ask you this? You're going into ICUs, as I understand it, that are under the most extreme pressure. Is there any sense that you, by visiting, might have added to the burden that the unit was under?
So this is one of the things that we thought about really carefully, that we must not add to the pressure they're already under. And that was part of the crafting of this product, was to make sure that they didn't feel like this was some surprise inspection by NHS England, that we were going in to support and give them time to share. And it was why it was important that it was peer support, that it was people who understood the pressures that they might be under, and you know, it was very carefully crafted so that we would not add to the burden, and it was designed so this should have been a positive experience for them as a unit.
In your statement, you have set out in particular 14 visits out of the 40 plus that you conducted. I'm not going to ask about all of them, but I would like to ask a little detail about some of them, ideally across the waves, if I can put it like that. And can I start, please, with what you experienced and saw when you went to Hospital 2, which was December 2020. I think you said there that it was a large teaching hospital, had 32 critical care beds, normally run at a capacity of 30. And you went there, I think, that autumn. Is that right?
That is correct.
And how many beds were they running during the first wave that they told you?
So this was a large teaching hospital that usually ran at 30 beds. At the peak of the first wave, they'd got to 55. So those numbers don't mean very much, do they? But what it means is that the resources they would have to run 30 beds were stretched to nearly 200%, nearly twice their capacity. And because it's not about the physical bed space, because it's about the people who are trained to deliver that critical care, that's a massive stretch for them. And they had certainly felt it.
I think you said they had declared a critical incident. Just tell us, what does that mean? What's that an indicator of?
So by the time of our visit, and part of the reason that we went in with the team, we took in a team before that day, they had recently declared a critical incident, which is to say that they were unable to maintain a acceptable standard of care without resort to extraordinary measures. And in the case of this, the declaration of that incident facilitated what we call the decompression of the unit. They transferred out a large number of patients over a very short space of time. And if I recall correctly, it was 28 transfers in 10 days, which is unprecedented in any, outside of COVID, it's an unprecedented number of transfers to undertake in that period of time.
When you went to the visit, what were the nurses and doctors telling you about how it had been either in the first wave or now coming up into start of wave 2 in reality?
So they were in massive trouble. They had transferred a large number of patients out just to keep their heads above water. We got into PPE, we got onto the shop floor. The doctors and the nurses in particular were really in trouble, and the accounts are very, very distressing. They were telling us that you know, for them, that the surge had started, you know, earlier in the autumn, and it was beginning to crescendo for them. So their accounts were really of just barely hanging on and only just managing with this massive transfer out of patients.
Did they say anything about how the first wave was for them as compared with how they were experiencing the second wave? Was it better, worse? Were they better equipped to deal with it because they'd been through it before?
So it was mixed. They said they'd learnt lessons and were better equipped, but a lot of the adrenaline had gone from the first wave. They said a lot of the support from elsewhere redeployed staff had gone, and they felt that actually their public support had started to go by the second wave. They felt that they'd been forgotten. One of the comments I remember is one of them said, the first wave felt like everybody's war, and this feels like nobody's war.
Did they say anything about sort of how the trust or the management of the hospital responded? Was there any positive comments?
So at this particular hospital, there was an excellent partnership between the senior leadership at that trust, who formed a link between the unit and the regional response teams. It was partly through that leadership that an effective and efficient decompression was achieved, which is what saves the unit in that moment.
I think you spent some time at Hospital 2 speaking to the lead ICU matron, and I'd like to ask you about that, please. It's your paragraph 65. There's a number of quotes there, but just stand back for a moment, Professor, and just tell me, what's your overriding recollection of your conversation with that matron?
I think that this was the point at which I really realised that it was going to be difficult as we came into this winter. This was, you know, one of the most effective clinical leaders I've ever met, and she was very clear that she was trying to look after her staff. She was trying to protect her staff at the same time as delivering care. It says in my notes that, that they didn't have enough staff to look after the patients coming through the door. They experienced a full range of challenge. They had a unit in which they had to admit at times several of their own members of staff from their own hospital, and some of those people from their own hospital did die. And she told me about how difficult that was. To be a unit, to admit your own staff, to look after your own staff in the middle of all of this, and to watch them die, was devastating. They were not alone. They were not alone in that.
I think she told you that they'd run out of physical bed spaces and had to resort to putting 2 patients into 1 bed space.
That's correct.
And she said there that they'd run out of normal ventilators and pumps and had to sometimes make decisions about which patients could be taken off a ventilator for a period of time, or who could manage a little longer on high-flow oxygen without advanced respiratory support. Does that sometimes happen in normal times? I hesitate to use that phrase.
None of that happens outside of COVID. And this is the thing about intensive care, and we were told this often by different hospitals. Intensive care is about the detail. They train you to pay attention to the detail. And for the clinical staff involved, for the whole team, it's about being able to throw the kitchen sink at your patient, the cutlery, the crockery, everything at them, and when that doesn't work, to be there at the end to give a good quality of death, and to be there for their family afterwards. And for these people, they were unable to do that, and the moral injury that followed from that is very clear. That they are trained. They knew the difference between what they should be delivering and what they were delivering, and that was very injurious.
Right. I think you said there that the matron told you it was harrowing for the family, but also for the nurse who was unable to provide any comfort to the relative. And that's, we can sometimes lose sight of that in the desire to treat the patient, but the role that is played at the end of life by ICU staff is obviously important as well. Help me about what the matron said about the scale of death that they had observed in that unit.
Yeah, and this is one of those things that is really very difficult to capture in figures. The scale of death experienced by the intensive care teams during COVID was unlike anything they had ever seen before. They're no strangers to death. They are the intensive care unit. They look after some of the sickest patients in the hospital. But the scale of death was truly, truly astounding. I went into this and other hospitals where they said it would be routine to see 3 to 5 deaths a day. I worked on a shift where we had 6 deaths in a single shift. Another hospital told us that they had 10 deaths in the shift, 2 of whom were their own staff. We had nurses talking about patients raining from the sky, where the nurses said that one of the nurses told me that they just got tired of putting people in body bags. Another hospital where they said that sometimes they were so overwhelmed that they were putting patients in body bags, lifting them from the bed, putting them on the floor, putting another patient in that bed straight away because there wasn't time. We went to another unit where things got so bad, they were so short of resource that they ran out of body bags, and they were instead issued with 9-foot clear plastic sacks and cable ties, and those nurses talk about being really traumatized by that because they had recurring nightmares about feeling like they were just throwing bodies away. These people are used to seeing death, but not on that scale and not like that. And whatever the figures show you, the experience for them was indescribable. And when we talk about capacity in healthcare systems, the toll on those teams from that scale, and it really was like nothing else I have ever seen, and certainly not like nothing else those teams had ever seen in their experience. It was incredibly difficult.
I can see it's taken its toll on you. You are, I dare say, no stranger to death either in your 26 years of experience. Why is even recounting this now so obviously painful for you, Professor?
I've never seen anything like this on any given day. I have served in a clinical role in several major incidents. I was on the scene of the Soho bombing in 1999. I worked in the emergency department during the 7th of July suicide bombings. I have attended a number of very serious civilian major incidents in my time with the Helicopter Emergency Medical Service. And nothing that I saw during all of those events was as bad as really COVID was every single day for every single one of these hospitals throughout the pandemic surges. It's painful now because it was very clear what was happening to the patients. It was very clear what was happening to the staff. The staff were very injured by just how overwhelmed they were by the whole thing.
Do you think the patients were getting the care that they needed?
They were getting the best care that could be delivered. I've said already that intensive care is about the detail. Once you start diluting the detail, it kind of stops being intensive care. It's really hard to describe this, and this is why I think these visits were important. Whatever you read in the columns on the Excel spreadsheets and the data didn't tell you this, and it didn't tell you about the actuality of the thing. And for the smaller hospitals, the thing that I described of transferring patients out to try and create capacity, what it meant for the smaller hospitals was that they were drowning in patients. The bigger hospitals would come in, try and relieve that pressure by transferring patients out. When you come in, you transfer patients out. You transfer out the most stable patients because they're the people who are most likely to be able to survive on more limited equipment in a moving vehicle for several hours if necessary. But what that meant for the smaller units was that they were left with a cohort of patients that were most likely to die. And for the smaller units, when we talk about the scale of death, over the next few weeks, those units would experience a mortality rate of in excess of 70% in some cases. 7 out of 10 of every patient that they had died. And I remember early in the visiting scheme, going into a unit, a small unit, and them saying, at the end of the day, after we'd had all of these accounts and accounts of this type, and with very little to offer them, and they said, thank you for coming. We thought we were alone. We thought we were doing it.
Try having a drink, Professor. Take your time.
They said, thank you for coming. We thought we were alone. We thought we were doing it wrong. And I just thought, how have we left them feeling like this? How has no one told them that this is not their fault, that it is the surge that has come with COVID that has led this to happen? But if you're a unit and you're isolated in that way, how can you know that it's not you? You watch 7 of every 10 patients die. How can you know? And so, those experiences basically affirmed for me the need for the visits and the need to try and get this information up.
All right. Can I ask you about a different visit? All right, but still in late December 2020, and what you have described in your statement as Hospital 9. You said there that had a baseline capacity of 17 beds. It had 88 whole-time equivalent nurses, and I think you were there in late December of 2020. And is this right, that they had transferred out 70 critically ill patients in the first wave and 110 in the second wave? Tell us, please, about the visit that you conducted at that hospital.
So that is correct. So that scale of transfers out tells you the constant pressure that this hospital's at. This is exactly one of the hospitals that I described that is a smaller hospital that is in need of constant decompression to just keep its head above water. it was a medium-sized unit. On this occasion, I'd been tasked to go there by the sector lead to actually have an urgent review of what this hospital needed. It was calling out for help. I'll never forget it. I got a phone call. I got asked how long it would take me to get to this hospital. And I said, well, when do you want me to go? And they said, if you get in your car now and drive, how long will it be? So I understood it was urgent. I got there. I got onto the unit. It was a scene from hell. The chief exec, the chief operating officer, chief medical officer, nursing officer, they were all on the shop floor, all trying to do it, but this was a hospital in massive, massive trouble. We went to the intensive care unit first. The intensive care unit was nursing a 1-to-4 ratio, 1 specialist ICU nurse to 4 intubated patients in the open area. In the side rooms, which have limited capacity, 1-to-2. There were so few staff that some of the nurses had chosen to either use the patient commodes in the side rooms, and some of the nurses had chosen to wear adult diapers because there was literally no one to give them a toilet break and take over their nursing duties. That was the intensive care unit. The intensive care unit was full. Their overflow areas were full. Their non-invasive ventilation unit, their respiratory unit was full. This was a hospital bursting at the seams. I then toured the hospital with the intensive care staff grade, a doctor who then looked after the unit and the rest of the hospital. I'll never forget being in the stairwell with him, and he's out of breath on the stairs because he himself has had COVID in the first wave and now is suffering the consequences of long COVID, but he's still there. The referrals are coming up from the floor. The referrals are the calls.
Is that from emergencies or
from the wards or the emergency department asking for help? That's what happens in routine intensive care. They say, this patient is too sick for us. Can you take them to intensive care? There were 6 of those referrals from the wards. There's no place to put them in the intensive care unit. We went into the emergency department. I looked through the resuscitation bays with this intensive care staff grade. Of the 5 patients there were 3 patients who also need intubating. So you've got 9 more patients who need intensive care urgently. There's no one there to intubate them. There's no one there to look after them. When we got to the emergency department, we were told that a patient had died in an ambulance waiting to get into the hospital the night before. The same thing had happened that morning. The oxygen alarms are going off. The chief operating officer is trying to troubleshoot that with the estates manager. It is genuinely the closest I've ever seen a hospital to a state of collapse in my entire career.
and I think you decided to effect what's called a rapid decompression of that unit, and did that result in 17 critically ill patients being transferred out that night?
That is correct. We called it back to the sector lead. I reported it up to the national EPRR team. That's what we did. We would come up with a plan for immediate support, and the only option here was to effect a rapid decompression. To put it into perspective, in an ordinary winter outside of COVID, throughout the whole of the country, the number of transfers that you might undertake to create capacity through the whole country in 2019 was 68. And that night we sent 17 away from that hospital. And it was all we could do.
How were the staff that you spoke to in that unit?
They were in total bits. I mean, and they'd been doing this throughout the first wave into the second for them, which had started in late autumn and was now moving into winter. They knew that worse was to come. They were still turning up. They had had, again, they had their own staff admitted to their own unit. Again, that they had massive staff sickness. So the other insult was that as COVID surged, so did the levels of sickness amongst the staff. So the massive staff sickness. We didn't obviously have time during that visit to talk to them in a reflective way. we went to them later, and they told us again about the scale of death. It was there that they told me that it was usual to see 3 deaths a day, more like 5. The intensive care consultant told me going on ward rounds and watching patients die in front of you, to the left of you, to the right of you, behind you. That was their experience, and they did everything that they could, but everything they could wasn't enough, and that was why it was so hard.
I think you comment in your statement that one of the staff members spoke about holding an iPad up to a family member as the patient was dying, and to effectively an end-of-life virtual visit. Clearly horrific for the family on the end of the iPad. What about the impact on the nurse who was trying to help that call?
So the care never stops in intensive care. There's always something you can do. And even at the end, when there is nothing more that you can offer therapeutically, your last duty to your patient is to ensure a good quality of death and to support the family through what follows. And that is usually about a relationship that you've built up with the family over a long period of time. But because of the remoteness of all of this, you hadn't established that rapport. And many of the patients' families understandably wanted to be present virtually at the end when visiting was difficult or wasn't allowed. And every single unit we went to, the nurses talked about the difficulty of that for them. At exactly the time when you would recuse yourself to give the patient and their family some dignity, you were actually holding a phone or an iPad up, showing them the monitor, showing the family the patient, listening to families imploring the patient not to die, and then the howling down the phone, and with nothing else that you can do other than to stay there and to be entrained into that grief. And I think they found that. I know that they found that. There wasn't a single nurse I spoke to who didn't talk about how traumatic that was.
I think after that visit, you went in very early January to what you describe as Hospital 10. And that was a large teaching hospital. Is that right, Professor?
That is correct.
Page 21
Yeah.
in your statement. And a slightly different but allied topic. I think there you spoke to an anaesthetic consultant who told you about what he had experienced on a night shift. Can I ask you about that, please? It's your paragraph 117. What did that consultant tell you?
So this was the experience of the large teaching hospitals, and they had the other end of it to the small hospitals. They were receiving patients, this constant infall of patients who had transferred from other hospitals in trouble, so they experienced surge in that regard. And they were capable and well-staffed and well-led, but their units were full, their overflow, they'd created another 2 overflow units within that building. They were ventilating people in their operating theatre departments. They had, in the first wave, been intubating and ventilating people in their operating theatres. And they too were in massive trouble. No one had it easy. And as we got into late December, again, the rate of death, the rate of work was massive, and one of the consultants there started a shift, watched 6 people die, ran an arrest right at the start of the shift, and talked and had resuscitated a young patient, and it had been unsuccessful. They'd spent 40 minutes trying to resuscitate this patient. And at the end of a resuscitation in which the patient has died, it's quite usual in normal practice to take your team aside to make sure they're okay and to try and care for your team. And at that point, you go around the team and you work out who you've got, and you're all dressed in PPE. And 3 of the members of the team who'd done cardiac compressions were medical students who'd volunteered to be on the ward. And you'd ordinarily try and support them. For some of these people, it was the first time that they had seen death, and there was no time because more death followed. There were more people arresting, and so you can't recover your staff in the moment, and you can't recover them later. And you know, when we talk of capacity in healthcare, you're over capacity by the time that you're at that point.
Yeah, I think you say in your statement that after the unsuccessful resuscitation of the young patient, within minutes there was another cardiac arrest, followed by several more, and it was that consultant in the space of a single 12-hour shift where 6 ICU patients died. Now, can I pause you there, Professor, because I'd like to ask you about what you did with this information, and could we call up, please, on screen INQ 72310. And I'd like to ask you about an email that you sent to Patrick Vallance on the 3rd of January. And he says, "Dear Kevin," it's the bottom email, "many thanks for sparing the time to speak to me today. Your account was harrowing and disturbing. I've spoken to Chris Whitty about this and he would like to hear more. I think the best plan would be to include Keith Willett, who I think is NHS England, and others in that, but Chris will have a view on how he'd like to make sure he hears from a number of other people. As you rightly said, this is a complex situation and the data alone may not tell the story. Thanks again for raising it." And there's reference to setting up the call. Now, why did you feel it necessary to speak to Patrick Vallance about what you had witnessed?
So this is actually an email from Patrick to me with Professor Chris Whitty in copy. I had gone on to a night shift myself at my own hospital around this time. I had gone through a pretty traumatic shift with a lot of death. On the way into that shift, I had been speaking to Jeremy Farrar, who I knew because I've been a research fellow with the Wellcome Trust, and really just as friend to friend, just to rant really about how bad things were, and how close to the edge I felt it all was. And he then said to me, would I like to speak to Patrick in the morning, who he also knew, Patrick Vallance in the morning, who he also knew personally. So I did my shift, and I came off the shift, and you know, this was on the back of all the visits and my own personal experience, and it wasn't. I was willing. For me, it was all about flow of information. This whole thing was about trying to get the right information to the right people for the best decisions, the best actions. And so it seemed to me that it wasn't unreasonable to try and share if that information hadn't been shared. I must say that I felt really well led and supported by my emergency preparedness, resilience and response team at NHS England, and in particular my line managers, Chris Moran and Keith Willett. They facilitated my ability to do the peer support visits. They understood the need to get this information, and my understanding is that they transmitted that up all the way as far as cabinet and beyond, but we somehow couldn't land that narrative, and so it felt natural to me to have that discussion, and so that is why I had that discussion, and it led to the email that you see there.
And did you then, in fact, I think, receive an email from Professor Whitty saying that Patrick Vallance had updated him, he was grateful for it being passed on, and effectively he said I would find it helpful to get those directly, probably most usefully with a few others, to get a rounded picture. The more actual data we have to support, the better. Anecdotal views on how things are, I think that should be in comparison with the first wave, are quite varied. If you prefer to talk to me directly, that's also fine. He had just come off a ward at UCLH. Did you speak to Professor Whitty?
I did, yes. I did the following morning. I spoke to Professor Whitty and relayed the same information, really. And again, I think both Professor Patrick Vallance and Professor Whitty were very receptive to that, and indeed, as the email says, resolved to convene a wider group of people to discuss the burgeoning pressures on the wards as it was happening in very early January.
I think, in fact, on the 4th, we went into lockdown again. So if that helps ground people with where we are, this is the timescale we're talking about. Now, just pausing there, we're in the troubling times of January 2021. There's another wave. Did you continue your visits throughout wave 2 and into the rest of 2021, Professor?
Yes, and in many ways that was the most important time. The period after the January 4 lockdown, I think, was the most dangerous period of the whole pandemic for us.
Why do you say that?
Because even after we'd gone into social restrictions, cases would continue to rise because of the incubation period of the virus. We knew that there was 2 or 3 week lag before we would see the peak of our intensive care caseload. And so actually, we were very operationally busy during that time, but we recommenced the visits as soon after that as we were able.
Can I ask you about a visit you undertook in June 2021? So it's your Hospital 14, Professor. We are out of wave 2, if ever we were out of it. Sorry, wave 1. Tell us what happened, please, when you visited the hospital in June 2021.
This was a small, medium-sized district general hospital. So much of what we saw of the pandemic publicly and in the press was of the larger hospitals, the larger teaching hospitals. But this is emblematic, really, of the experience of the smaller hospitals. Very small baseline capacity, only 9 beds. And as soon as you stray much above that, you feel extreme surge. And they had got hit really, really badly all the way through. And the account there was really telling. The small units have no spare capacity. They're stretched even on an ordinary day. So any surge to them was particularly difficult to deal with. And this is an emblematic experience for the smaller hospitals. The ITU consultant there that I spoke to said he got a few hours' notice before being told he was going to resident on call, so he would be present in the hospital throughout the on-call shifts. There's no provision made for on-call facilities. He talks about having to sleep in the boot of his Ford Galaxy when he was on duty for 3 months at the start of the pandemic. They talk about running out of PPE. They talk about going to Screwfix to get visors. They talk about running out of theatre scrubs and having to go to the local private hospitals and beg them for their supply. And when they ran out of that, they talk about having to had one shift where they had no theatre scrubs and they went around in their underwear and they went around in their underwear and gowns for the shift.
Can I pause you there? Did they give an indication of the pressures with PPE, which wave that was occurring in?
So that was in the first wave, and the first wave was where most of the equipment shortages occurred.
Did you speak to any nurses whilst you were at Hospital 14?
Yeah.
What did they tell you?
They had had sustained pressure. Even the summer had been bad for them. They had had sustained pressure almost since the pandemic had kicked off in spring of 2020. You can see there in paragraph 151, they say, as a team, we're fractured. We're not sure how to do things safely. There are so many rules and regulations that have gone out of the window. They were a young unit. They had very few experienced staff, and the experienced staff they had left very quickly because of mental health issues. One of the Band 5 nurses, quite a junior nurse, is saying, we were a young unit. Most of us had less than a year's experience. I was newly qualified. I didn't know what I was doing half the time. They had a massive staff sickness rate, nearly 20%, nearly 1 in 5 of their units, 1 in 5 of their nurses off sick at any one time.
Were they talking about January 2021?
This is 21, yeah.
So you're visiting in June, but they're telling you how it was in January that year.
Yeah, and January 2021 for them as a smaller hospital with limited capacity really brought them to their knees. They talk about how hard the burden was on the intensive care consultants, how many shifts that they had to do. They talk about the consultants having to work 10 weekends in a row. This is the same consultants who in the first wave had slept in their cars. You know, that statement that they made to me in June 2021 when I asked them how they were, you know, coming into the summer, they said, we're broken, we're worse than broken. I don't know, we can't look after 9 patients, that's their establishment, that's what they should be able to do. We can't surge to any more than that, we can't surge beyond that. And that consultant, and I need to get these words right, but, you know, he said, look, we ran out of equipment, we ran out of drugs, we ran out of nurses, we ran out of goodwill. You know, that is what this thing did to those people in those units. This is what happens. I went into another unit of similar size where they talked about how on the television what you saw was these big units who complained about being short of equipment, but were usually wearing PPE.
Yeah.
And how they said that they were watching those programs and they were standing in their own units wearing cagoules and waterproof trousers that the chief exec had bought from an outdoor shop. And they were angry, actually, that is all that people knew was this site of well-resourced hospitals, when the truth in the smaller hospitals was just that.
Can I just ask you now, if you stand back and think about we've looked at a few hospitals there, but if I ask you to stand back and think about the 40 or so visits that you made, what was your takeaways from all of those? What were the other things that you were hearing that perhaps you haven't told us about this morning?
We had a substantial program by the end. We had a secretariat of about 6 people who supported the visits administratively. I had about 40, maybe 30 or 40 people who staffed up these visits, to whom I'm extremely grateful to. We all had the same conclusions. The first was, we were always surprised at just how supported the staff felt by this. The sense that they weren't alone, the sense that they weren't getting it wrong, that it wasn't their fault. And that other people elsewhere in the country were experiencing similar or the same. The ability just to talk with people who were going through the same thing was incredibly supportive. Many of them said it was the first time they realized that they weren't on their own. It absolutely confirmed my belief that the data, the information are important, but the insight is gained by going and seeing these people and having a group of people who know what they're looking at that system and understanding what it is. It is easy for us to think that we knew what was going on, and this isn't just a problem with the NHS. Any large organisation suffers this problem. Any multi-layered organisation suffers this problem of what you can measure most easily that's seen at the top between what is actually happening at the front line. And I think that it was easy to convince ourselves that we knew what was happening. But you don't know. You don't know unless you're the people going into that shop floor. You don't know if you're not the people who are putting on PPE before you've got vaccinations available, wondering if it's buttoned up okay. You don't know unless you're the people who've run out of body bags and put people in plastic sacks. You don't know if you're not the people who've held onto iPads while relatives are screaming down the phone. You don't know if you haven't sat in transfer vehicles next to a patient who's dying of COVID, wondering if your PPE is buttoned up well enough that you might not do the same. It is impossible to know. So, and that's why, although this is not, as you pointed out, milady, hard numerical data, the information is important. There is more to know than just what you can count. And I think that was well understood by my EPRR team. I was well supported in that role. There is a tendency for us in healthcare to, eschew that kind of anecdotal data. It is the lowest form of information, but I don't think that was true here. I think the information was important, and I think it did change the way that we saw these people. And the most important thing is the need to support their well-being. It is a complex system. It has a social component and it has a technical component. We got good at managing the technical component. The human resource, the people that stop it all from falling apart from day to day, we didn't really have sufficient mechanisms to measure and monitor that, or indeed protect them.
In your statement, you speak of the professional nurse advocate programme. We heard a little of that from Dame Ruth, but do you have any views about the utility or otherwise of that programme?
So the professional nurse advocate programme, which at least I'm told by Emma Whitty, who was the Director of Mental Health Nursing at the time, and Dame Ruth May herself, the data, the information, the insight that we gathered through the visits and through wellbeing surveys informed their decision to support and develop that programme. That programme was there as an acknowledgement that there needed to be support and recovery. It, for the first time, provided nurses with a role whereby they faced their own staff and they cared for their own staff, and you know, that was such an important thing. And actually, as the visits progressed and the professional nurse advocate programme developed, everyone told us how important that programme was, to have one of your own team able to look after you. And so, you know, I was very, Dame Ruth May was very responsive to these data from early on, you know, from the summer of 2020. I think she referred to in her own evidence that it helped convince her that we should try and draw a hard limit of no lower than 1 intensive care nurse to 2 ventilated patients in coming waves. So you know, I was happy to hear that. I was happy to hear that there was some consequence from the work.
I think we've probably gleaned your lessons learned, Professor, but what about some recommendations for how not to end up in this position in the event of a future pandemic? Is there anything that you can recommend to Her Ladyship to try and ameliorate the stresses on the staff in those ICU units?
So much of this pandemic was about the concept of capacity and the capacity of the healthcare system. So much hinged upon that. But healthcare, capacity in healthcare systems is a complex feature of a complex systems. It requires a complex assessment. There is, as I've mentioned, in the system, a human element and a technical element. And we get good at managing technical elements. But the social element that we depend upon to close the gap between reality and expectation in a system that every single day wants to tear itself apart, and during COVID much more so, we do not pay enough attention to. So in terms of the way forward, for me, at least through this, I think there are 4 things. I think those peer support visits were important. I felt well supported and facilitated to develop them by a team in emergency preparedness and response who understood the need for them, and I'm grateful for that. I was very well led there and very well supported. I think that mechanism is an important mechanism both during a COVID and outside of that.
The EPRR mechanism?
The peer support
Thank
mechanism.
You. Sorry, I misunderstood.
Having a mechanism by which you can support colleagues in this way, gather information, to short-circuit the flow of information from the front line all the way up to the top. You need to have a mechanism that stops information having to flow through all the filters in between, so that the decisions are made at the top. There's a way of the people up front line to signal their experience without it being diluted. So firstly, for this and future pandemics, the peer support system was important. This ability to go in and visit hospitals was important, I think, and we should preserve and develop it. It's not just a thing that you magic up. It took effort and nuance to do it. It took time to understand how to get these people to have the trust in you to share the things that
It's all right.
So to share the things that they shared, for them to know that someone cared really about what was happening to them, to know that they weren't alone. It takes effort to do that. We'll forget that very quickly. You need to preserve those mechanisms, and we need to have them arguably outside of a pandemic, certainly for one in the future. I think that ability to have that context is important. That's my first thing. The second thing is, you know, we talk about learning lessons and preparing for the future. We must, and the knowledge of how to manage a pandemic at operational level, and I'm not talking about the strategic lessons, I'm talking about operational level. The pandemic was managed by the teams in the frontline areas, day in, day out, not just on intensive care, throughout the hospital, throughout the ambulance service, in the community, general practice, in our social care facilities, in our care homes. The know-how of how to stop a system from tearing itself apart when faced with a challenge that should have been insurmountable exists still within those people, and it must be preserved. I'm not sure that we're doing enough to preserve that operational, organisational memory, and organisational memory is short. And so the preparations for next time need to start now and need to be properly resourced, need to be captured.
And your third?
Is about well-being. Again, it is that point about, and I repeat it deliberately because it's so important, but I think so overlooked. We manage the technical aspect of this complex system. We do not look after the social aspect. We go in and we check our machines and our drugs every day to make sure that they are there when we need them in a difficult moment. No one really does that for our staff. We do not have the right mechanisms to measure and monitor, protect and promote the well-being of the human workforce upon whom everything depends, whether you're in a pandemic or not. Well-being of the workforce should be a central strategic priority for the NHS, whether it's in pandemic or not. And it needs better resourcing and it needs better attention than it has had. And the final thing I'd like to say, just at wider scale, is it was very clear when we were going into hospitals about the disparity in the provision for different areas, the smaller hospitals versus the larger teaching hospitals. If you wanted to find an indicator substance to drop into a general population to see where healthcare was most needed, then COVID was it. And it showed us that the care and the resource wasn't where it needed to be. And we should reflect upon that. This is the biggest national emergency that this country has faced since World War II. Out of the medical needs that arose out of World War II and the Blitz, in part came the recognition of a need to care for the need for us to be able to care for the collective need for us to care as a country. And in part, it was part of the impetus of the establishment of the NHS. It was a lesson that we learned through that awful experience that we needed something more going forwards. We need to learn after COVID those lessons, and perhaps for me the most salient one is that we do not look after the people who deliver the care. If we do not care for the carers, they cannot care for our patients.
Professor, that's all the questions I have.
There are just a few more questions from Ms Munro. Can you cope with a few more? And then we'll break until we'll be finished.
Thank you, my lady.
Ms Munro.
Thank you very much. My lady, and I can say to Professor Fong that during the course of his evidence this morning, the vast majority of my questions have either directly or sufficiently been answered. And there are literally just a couple, which I hope I can summarise, Professor Fong, and take it relatively quickly. My name's Alice Munro. Professor, I represent COVID Bereaved Families for Justice UK. And on their behalf, just a few questions, please. Thank you. My first question was about data. You've spoken a lot about that and described how the data did not paint the picture of the severity of what you were seeing on the shop floor, as you've described it, in ICU. Effectively, it's a falsely positive picture was being painted by the data. So my second question arising from that was, Was that disconnect between the picture painted by the data and what you yourself were seeing on the shop floor due, perhaps in part, to a focus on physical bed space rather than considering the question of the adequacy of staffing requirements?
So I think that it is natural in the face of a fast-moving pandemic that initially you focus on the things that you can count most easily. But as I've said before, not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything that you can count counts. You know, it's that old adage. And so the focus on numbers of beds, it's not that it was a falsely positive picture, but it was an insufficient picture to which you need to add context and insight, which is what these visits did. So I think that the second thing I would say is that I think there was, at least initially, a misunderstanding of what an intensive care bed is. I think that people thought of it as being some technical piece of furniture into which you plugged a patient. It requires a staff, not just doctors and nurses. It requires physiotherapists, dietitians, occupational therapists, radiographers, radiologists, a whole huge team of people. The bed itself is just a shorthand for that. You know, it is no more use to you than an aeroplane is to an airline without its staff.
Thank you. Professor Fong, it's very clear from your evidence that you've given us this morning that blanket statements or opinions such as ICU was not overwhelmed would be oversimplistic and would lack nuance. In concluding your evidence today, you mentioned that so much hinged upon capacity. Sort of bringing it all together, can we describe what we were seeing during the pandemic then in terms of capacity being overwhelmed, that it was overwhelmed in different individual locations and at different times, but throughout the pandemic?
It's difficult, isn't it, to know whether, and the language changed in the national assessments between the risk of a unit being overwhelmed or a country being overwhelmed and the risk of it exceeding its quote-unquote assumed capacity. From the perspective of intensive care, if you ask yourself what intensive care is, it is the detail. It is the detail and the dedication, the ability to provide everything that can be provided in an effort to provide the best care for a patient who is critically unwell. If your definition of overwhelmed is your ability to provide that, then at many times and in many places the units were overwhelmed. You just have to listen to the evidence that was given today to know that these units were beyond their capacity to cope. And the thing is that they did anyway. On paper, they shouldn't have been able to cope with this, and they still turned up.
Thank you. And then the second point, Professor Fong, is on diluted staffing ratios. In your witness statement at page 24, paragraph 128, you deal with one of your visits to Hospital 11. It's a general district hospital. And you state that initially you met the lead matron and the clinical lead for ICU and asked them how things had been for them. And the clinical lead told you that they were already at 1:3, in some places 1:4 nursing ratios. And you then go on in paragraph 29 in very clear and graphic detail to describe what the lead matron told you about the effects that was having on many of her staff, who she described as terrified. That visit was January 2021. Professor Fong, from your observations, your discussions, what you saw and what you heard in practice, is it correct that diluting staff ratios continued into and throughout the second wave of the pandemic?
So my understanding is that there was a clear decision between the first wave of the spring of 2020 and subsequent waves that no unit or units would aim to go no lower than one specialist ICU nurse to 2 ventilated patients. That was the goal. And I think that was absolutely important at redefining what capacity really meant for these hospitals. But as the surge came through in autumn for some regions and then in winter 2020 and then into 2021, even that goal was not, you couldn't sustain it. So the goal was to hold at 1 to 2, but even though that goal was set, it speaks to how challenged the units were, that this unit was not able to maintain that. And you refer to the paragraph that follows. This unit at this point were in such trouble, and they talked about coming into work one day. One of their senior nurses had vomited on the way to work out of nervousness of what she was about to face, how terrified they were, you know, this is a team of people that are operating at the edge of their own personal capacity at great cost to themselves. And so we talk about physical capacity, but there is the capacity of a human workforce, and that was clearly exceeded here.
Finally, Professor Fong, in the course of your evidence this morning, you've told us from your own real experience of actually visiting the peer visits that you made, that you saw staffing ratio significantly higher than the recommended 1-to-1. You spoke of diluting the detail of intensive care. From your visits, observations, speaking to healthcare workers, Professor Fong, would it be fair to say that despite the monumental efforts and dedication of the staff that were available, the impact upon the quality of care in ICU can properly be described as devastating in some places?
Despite the best efforts of everyone really in the system, everyone, the surge in demand for healthcare caused by the upswell of critically ill patients by COVID-19 meant that it was not possible to deliver the standard of care that would ordinarily be expected in a non-COVID period.
Professor Fong, those are my questions, and thank you very much. On behalf of those I represent, we're very grateful for the visits that you made and the very powerful evidence you've given us this morning. My lady, thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms Munro. Professor Fong, we're extraordinarily grateful to you for helping us. It's obvious how distressing it was for you, and obviously reliving such an ordeal is never easy. It's not easy to describe, as you've had to do this morning. It's not easy for us to listen to, but we had to do it. So thank you so much for all you've done. Could I also thank you for not only the excellent work you did with the support scheme, for the work you did in the units, but also for your work with the Air Ambulance Service. As you may know from having been the coroner at the 7/7 inquest, I am a huge supporter of the work they do. It's brilliant. So thank you very much. I shall return at 25 to 12.
All right.
My lady, may I call, please, Professor Sir Christopher Whitty.
I swear by Almighty God that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Professor Whitty, thank you for coming along to help again. And again, I reiterate my apologies for the demands we make upon you and your office, and we're very grateful for your help.
Thank you, my lady.
Thank you. Professor, your full name, please.
Christopher Whitty.
Right. We have a statement from you in Module 3, ending 410237, which I think you have in front of you.
I do.
I know you've given your background in previous modules, but you became the Chief Medical Officer, I think, on the 1st of October of 2019. Is that correct?
I did.
And you are, by background, a consultant physician in infectious diseases and tropical medicine at UCLH.
Yes.
And you have a number of other qualifications as set out in your statement. I won't go through them. You worked shifts, is this right, throughout the pandemic?
I did. I decided at the beginning to stick to my usual rota, and that therefore meant I worked shifts in actually Wuhan, the Alpha wave, and then after the vaccine, and very different environment, the Delta wave and the Omicron wave. So I did see various phases of this.
Tell us about wave one, please. What was it like working? Was it on COVID wards that you were working?
Yes, and in wave one, I was towards the tail end of wave one in the middle of the year. So by this stage, a lot of learning had been done already by my colleagues. But I think much of the trauma that was very powerfully laid out by Professor Fong in the last evidence, with which I fully concur, to be clear, was very apparent in many of the colleagues I had. There was a period of recovery. I think what then he describes, and I think this is accurate, I was working, I did 2 weeks over the Christmas New Year period at the end of 2020, and which is in fact very similar to the time he was talking about. And that was an extraordinarily difficult time, even in the relatively privileged environment of a teaching hospital, which is where I work, and I fully agree with his point that actually in less resource, smaller settings, the outcomes were even more difficult.
When you were working on the COVID wards, what type of mask were you wearing?
I wore exactly what was in the guidelines, so that for most of the time was a surgical fluid-resistant mask.
And thinking towards the end of the work during wave two, were there any noticeable differences between Wuhan and wave two?
I think that the scale of the second wave was actually underappreciated in the general public. I think people who had relatives, obviously people who were sick, fully understood that this was in fact a larger wave in terms of total numbers of people who were severely ill and indeed who sadly died. And the first two waves are the ones which had the extraordinary mortality and the very large numbers in ICU. By the time we got to the Delta, most of the Delta wave and the Omicron wave, vaccination had completely changed the pattern. So although people were still getting COVID and still coming into hospital, and it put enormous strain on the system as a whole, the proportion, fortunately, who were going to ICU and going on to die was massively lower, and that led to a very different outlook.
What about the staff in wave two, though? They've been through all of the various ups and downs from March 2020. Was there any appreciable difference in the way they were feeling and behaving by the end of the relevant period?
I think that one thing that in my experience did make quite a big difference was when staff knew that the vaccine was coming. Because until that point, there was a sense of this could go on for literally years with wave after wave. Once the second wave in particular was incredibly harrowing, as Professor Fong has laid out, but knowing that there was something which is going to significantly reduce that, I think for many people at least meant they felt there was some light at the end of the tunnel, although it was a very long tunnel.
Yeah. You set out in your statement the role of the Office of Chief Medical Officer, and I'm not going to go through it all, but is this right? You are the senior advisor to government, you are independent of government, and you can therefore write reports and make public statements which don't accord to government policy if that's how you consider the evidence to fall.
That's correct.
All right. You have a small private office, I think, including public health specialty registrars. There were 3 deputy chief medical officers, is that right, during the relevant period?
There were, although one of them was mainly working for the NHS.
Right. And I think you said at its largest there was 19 members of staff, but typically you only have about 12 members of staff, is that correct?
That is correct, and I think the small scale has a big advantage and a significant limitation. The big advantage is everybody understands what everyone else is thinking and you can think as a unit. Obviously, the disadvantage is it's quite a small resource, and in an emergency of this size, it meant we had to be very careful about which things we prioritised in terms of the things we did and which things we didn't.
Right. You do not have, is this correct, a direct role in the organisation or operation of the NHS, and so therefore clinical advice to the NHS comes from within NHS England, is that correct?
In a purely statutory sense, the 2012 Act significantly changed the way in which the Chief Medical Officer interacted with the NHS and gave the NHS, in a sense, complete independence. And therefore, there's no role for the CMO in the structure. However, there would be situations where senior members of the NHS and indeed other members of the NHS would talk to me to really talk through a problem as a peer in the system. For example, I was in constant contact with Professor Steve Powis, who is, I think you're going to be hearing from subsequently, and also with Dame Ruth May, who you've already spoken to.
Yeah, all right. I think, though, you say you may have, from time to time, provided technical advice which might help NHS England make decisions.
Yes, and I think there are sort of two kinds of advice I would give in this, but I tried as far as I could to make clear who was maintaining the final decision making, because otherwise things get very confused. And the first form was, I am a technical expert both in the epidemiology and the treatment of infections. Many of my colleagues were not, so sometimes I was actually giving literally technical advice from my own personal professional background, and sometimes it was as a senior member of the collective leadership of the medical profession and healthcare more widely. So those are the two kind of environments.
Well, I just wanted to be clear about the remit of your role as CMO. It may be at times we trespass into matters that you provided advice from, or were in the room when decisions were being made, but please make it clear if you're unable to answer any question or it's out with your experience or expertise. All right. Can I start, though, with this? I think in Module 2, you explained that one of the reasons for the lockdown in March 2020 was to prevent the NHS from being overwhelmed. Can I ask you this? Was overwhelmed ever defined by those that were making that decision?
Not really, and I think that it's become, unfortunately, quite a loaded term where people, depending on what point they're trying to make, either say things were or were not overwhelmed. I think the aim of it, though, was to minimise the number of people who died both directly and indirectly from COVID in the health service. And if you'd like me to expand slightly on that answer, Professor Smith yesterday, CMO for Scotland, which incidentally has a slightly different interaction with the NHS, I should have said that on the way, talked about the 4 harms. I put it slightly differently, but I gave the same 4 harms. The first harm being the direct harms from COVID, which you're trying to reduce the number of deaths directly. But the second, and very important for this, is the indirect harms that come from the system being overwhelmed or at least unable to cope. And in fact, all diseases, not just COVID, having higher mortality rates than they would have had. And I think both of those are relevant to this.
I could ask you to slow down.
Apologies.
Thank you.
Apologies, Chair.
No. You said in Module 2 that, well, you were asked this, what was the understanding as to what would likely happen to the NHS if a lockdown were not imposed? And you said, well, I think that the first thing was going to get to the point where it got no longer able to function in any sense close to normal. Taking that answer and the aim to try and minimise the number of direct and indirects, do you think that we achieved that aim?
Well, I think that I'm going to work backwards from what would have happened if we'd gone further. I think the key thing to remember, and I think people forget this, is that this was an exponentially rising, in the technical sense of the term, an exponentially rising thing with an epidemic with a doubling rate of 3 to 4 days at the point we were talking about. 4 doubling times more would have led us to an absolutely catastrophic situation. Now, I'm not saying that where we were was anywhere short of incredibly difficult, and in many places, individual elements of hospitals, individual bits of the system were coping nowhere near where they would be if COVID wasn't there. That's self-evidently true. But if we had not had the lockdown, the expectation is that would have got a lot worse. I don't mean just trivial worse, but really quite substantially worse.
Do you think that the NHS was able to function?
Well, I think that makes it sound quite binary. I mean, the NHS continued to treat sick patients throughout. It continued to treat people who did not have COVID throughout. In fact, I think at all times, actually, there were more people in hospital who did not have COVID than had COVID. I think certainly for the great majority. I'm sure there were places where that was not true, wasn't true in many ICUs, as we heard this morning, but more generally. So, there was still a functioning health service. It was clearly functioning at well below the capacity that it would have normally. And I think, just to make a slightly wider context, in a normal winter, the NHS is very, very strained. And Lord Darcy has just done a report. I'm not going to go into that in detail, but just making the point, the NHS is under strain in every year, even prior to COVID. This was a very major, this is the largest, as you know, medical emergency since the Second World War in a high-income country. And this made the system really not work anywhere near as effectively as it would if COVID had not been there. But that's self-evidently true.
Yeah.
If that were not the case, it would be extraordinary.
I ask you because I think you heard from Professor Fong just a moment ago. I think you've seen the report from the intensive care experts that the module has prepared. I think you've also seen the research that the inquiry commissioned in relation to escalation of care. And I just want to ask you about how your answers tally with some of the things that we've actually heard over the last nearly 3 weeks. Could we have up on screen, please, INQ 499523? And I'm not going to take you through all of the pages, Professor, but could we go to page 3? And you will appreciate that this cannot be representative across the entirety of the healthcare workforce. But nonetheless, there were 1,683 healthcare professionals who were spoken to, over half of whom reported that some patients could not be escalated to the next level of care due to lack of resources during either wave 1 or wave 2. A&E doctors and paramedics were more likely to have ever been unable to escalate care due to a lack of resources at either wave. And so when you speak at functioning below capacity, we understand now what you mean, but what about the people that couldn't get the care that they would otherwise have got? How does that tally with what you're telling us?
Well, I consider they're entirely congruent with one another. And I mean, what you've said what was seen in this report in no way surprised me. In fact, that's the one thing where I probably departed from the evidence of Professor Smith yesterday. Almost everything else I agreed with. Not everything else I agreed with. Was this, that he expressed some surprise. I didn't express it. I didn't see any surprise in this. I would caveat this by saying, if you said in the middle of a winter in the NHS pre-COVID had asked these questions, you would not have got a 100% everyone can be escalated to the next level. And I think it is unrealistic, even in those circumstances, to think this would have been the case. Pretty unsurprisingly, for the biggest pandemic in 100 years for this country, the system was unable to escalate things in the way it normally would. I don't think, that doesn't seem to me a surprising statement, and it is entirely in keeping with what I previously said.
If it's not surprising to you, or indeed those with whom you work, how do we in future prevent stats like this, evidence like we've just heard from occurring again? That's a very broad question. And Professor, can I say at the outset, this is not a counsel of perfection. I do take that point. Yeah. But how do we either surge up or create more capacity so that there isn't a healthcare worker saying, I couldn't give that patient a bed?
Well, I think there are kind of broadly only two ways we can do it, because we have to assume a future pandemic on this scale will occur. That's a certainty. But for the UK, not for the world, but for the UK, this is a 1 in 100 years event, because the last time there was something this big was back in 1819. For something on this scale, you therefore have to have two things. You can have more capacity. And taking ICU in particular, the UK has a very low ICU capacity compared to most of our peer nations in high-income countries. Now, that's a choice. That's a political choice. It's a system configuration choice, but it is a choice. But therefore, you have less reserve when a major emergency happens, even if it's short of something of the scale of COVID. So that's the first alternative. The second alternative is to do things which, and this in my view is, this is undoubtedly necessary either way, that minimise the scale of the impact of the pandemic. And that, of course, is what the various attempts at lockdown and other NPIs were really about. But the way out of these is always going to be science in the end, as it was for this one with vaccines.
The ability to scale up was something that was done at real speed during February and March 2020. But do you have any thoughts about the timing with which a scale-up should happen in the event of a pandemic? If we take this pandemic as an example, by January, the reports were coming out of the Wuhan. It got progressively worse through January and February into March and the lockdown decision. Do you have any views as to when, during a month or two lead-in to the pandemic hitting, that surging and scaling up should take place?
Well, I think Professor Fong laid out absolutely rightly that the key thing, which is the rate-limiting thing for scale-up, is people, trained people. So you can buy beds, you can buy space. You can even put in oxygen and things, and I think we learned some lessons from, for example, trying to set up the Nightingale hospitals about the difficulties of doing that. But fundamentally, the limit to that system, as to any system, is trained people. And there is no way you can train someone in 6 weeks to have the experience of an experienced ICU nurse or an experienced ICU doctor. It is simply not possible. So if you don't have it going into the emergency, if it's an emergency of this speed of onset, you shouldn't have any illusions you're going to have it as you hit the peak.
So does that mean we need more potentially skilled up ICU nurses, for example?
Well, I think, there are strong arguments for that in between emergencies, and I think the argument for having them in the hope that we can be better off for a 1 in 100-year event, I think, is less strong than some of the other arguments for having more ICU capacity.
Okay. Can I just deal with some other features to your role and the role of the OCMO? Can I ask you about your interaction with nerve tag, please? I think you say in your statement at 3.45 that you are there as observers to nerve tag. Have I got that right?
Yes, there's the architecture is a bit complicated, but fundamentally nerve tag actually advises the CMO under ordinary circumstances. Once SAGE was in operation, in practice, nerve tag advised SAGE. But the CMO has a very close link to nerve tag. That's just the way this particular interaction works.
Right, okay. So thinking about you, because I think you were a co-chair of SAGE, is that correct?
I was co-chair of SAGE. I didn't sit on nerve tag, but my colleague, Professor Van Tam, sat on as an observer, and indeed he'd previously been a chair of it before he joined government.
Does that mean that the OCMO observer does not contribute or feed into the decisions made by nerve tag?
Well, I think that people use observer in different terms. My view is an observer is someone who can certainly, in almost all scientific committees, can pose questions and indeed, if it's their area of expertise, make points. So an observer is not someone who sits passively. There are some kind of environments where an observer, that is exactly what an observer is. But in this environment, I would have expected, in fact, hoped that Professor Van Tam and indeed any other expert advisor would contribute if they had something useful to add. But in formal terms, they're not a formal member and they're not a formal voting member were a vote to occur.
Understood. All right. Now, although you weren't on it, I think the first nerve tag meeting was the 13th of January of 2020. And I'd just like to look at INQ 223307, please. Well, obviously in very early days, but you speak there of, it's an email from you to a number of DCMOs, other people in DHSE, and you say, you thank them for a note, and you say, my view is that any one of the 3 triggers would mean we start taking a close interest and considering risk to the UK. So in short now, the word had come out that there was the virus circulating in China, and you say the 3 triggers are: 1, healthcare workers dying. This is often the early warning that a new infection is both severe and transmissible, e.g. SARS, MERS, Ebola. This would be most concerning. Then spread from person to person, and then geographical spread. Given that one of the triggers was healthcare workers dying, who was it who was responsible for monitoring the number of deaths of healthcare workers?
So in a pandemic or major epidemic like this, this is one of the first things that is people will spot. And of course, the healthcare workers are working in the healthcare system, so people are aware they're there, the deaths occur. They're usually in young and healthy people in comparison to older populations who are in general system. So it's often, unfortunately, and this is one of the risks of doing medicine and doing medicine in infectious disease areas, is you are going to be in the first line of people who will be potentially exposed to an infection. And if you look at, for example, SARS, MERS, and Ebola, in all of those, healthcare workers were massively disproportionately affected in terms of the deaths compared to the general population.
Right, but given that it's one of the triggers, who is it that's going to monitor the numbers of healthcare workers dying? Is it DHSE? Is it OCMO? Is it
these data would be coming from China to WHO or by indirect routes. All of them, what I was signalling here is if you start to see even a small increase in healthcare worker deaths, that is a very concerning sign and one that you would want to would actually escalate, even if the numbers are small in that situation.
And then within the UK, who is it that's responsible for monitoring healthcare workers?
Well, I think in terms of overseas data, this would come into PHE, normally speaking, now UK HSA. In the current, if it was in the UK, of course, it would be the NHS that would first identify this under normal circumstances.
So if I understand you correctly, as at January 2020, you were looking for information coming effectively from China at that stage as to whether there was healthcare workers dying. But do I take it that if we started having healthcare workers dying in the UK, that would be equally an indication of how severe the pandemic could be?
That is correct.
All right.
Remembering this is the 5th of January. This is very, very early in our understanding.
Now, given that is healthcare workers dying is one of the triggers, certainly from your perspective, do you think steps should have been taken as early as January and February to assess what action could be done to protect UK healthcare workers from either catching the disease?
Well, I think that there are clearly two lines to that. The first and the most important is to try and do what you can to reduce the risk that the disease gets into the UK, if that's possible, and that it takes off in a major way. And that was covered in the last module. I'm not going to go into that, but just to be clear, that is the most important thing you can do. There's clearly a second area, which is making a decision about where you would start, particularly early on when you don't understand the infection. And the initial decision was taken that this would be treated in UK terms as a high consequence infectious disease. And part of the reason for that, not the only reason, but part of the reason for that is to nurse and provide medical care for people in environments which are relatively highly protected, with highly trained skilled staff who are used to dealing with high levels of PPE, and therefore a much lower probability of coming to harm themselves. There are additional benefits as well to the patient.
Well, since you mentioned HSIDs, can I deal with that at this stage? I don't think you were involved in the decision to classify and declassify.
I wasn't formally involved in it, but I was aware of it, and I agreed with both the classification and the declassification.
All right. Well, I was going to come on to the fact that you set that out in your statement. You, I think, say in your statement, forgive me, I've just lost my page, that you made some points about HSIDs, including the significant disadvantages to the disease as being classified. Could you just set those out for us, please, Professor? And it's at paragraph 335, if it helps you.
Yes, I can remember what I said on that. So the advantage to the healthcare workers is the one I've just given. It's a very important one. It's absolutely fundamental. The advantage initially to patients is that they are all cared for in a small number of specialist areas where people can accrue experience of managing a new infection, and that actually is beneficial. They also tend to have access to drugs and approaches which are not available more widely. However, they come at a significant disadvantage once you get beyond a quite small number of cases. People have to be moved around the country, which can be very tricky. And indeed can involve exposing staff in transit, which is problematic. They also are an environment which actually is quite frightening to be in if you don't need it. I don't know if anyone's ever seen these on TV or in other areas, but these are not environments which are the easiest ones to operate in. They are set up principally to protect the staff who are working in them quite properly, but that can in itself cause some risks actually, because the level of barrier between the staff and the patient is quite significant. So there are a number of downsides. There are also some very clear upsides, particularly with a very dangerous disease or a disease early in its understanding.
Now, we've been told that as part of the classification of COVID as an HSID, there is effectively a PPE kit that is required to be worn, which includes FFP3 masks. Is that correct?
That is correct, yeah.
Right. And are you able to confirm that the declassification of COVID as an HSID does not have any bearing on what IPC measures are thereafter recommended to be worn.
That is also correct.
So it could be declassified and FFP3 could continue to be recommended. Yeah. A mixture of masks, no masks, depending on the circumstances.
Yes, and I think to highlight one point which has come up in various witnesses, not fully been picked up, I think, is you've got the kit, but you also have to have the training to use the kit properly. People who work in HSIDs and indeed work in infectious disease units, I'm one of them, are trained to use multiple different forms of PPE at quite a high level. You go through training to do that. You practice that training. People take fit testing very seriously and they're ready for it. All of these things are not going to be true outside that system. And just having kit but no training often produces little or no benefit. The training is fundamental to making the kit useful.
By the time COVID was declassified as an HSID, there was UK IPC guidance which effectively said FFP3s for AGPs or hotspots where AGPs are going to be conducted and FRSM in the other areas. I paraphrase, but do you agree with that broad?
That is a good paraphrase.
All right. Do you think that was perceived by some in the profession as a downgrading of PPE that was required?
Well, I mean, I'm sure the professions involved being large, I'm very confident you'd find some people who thought that was a downgrading. But I think most people would see that as a quite normal sequence. Okay. They may or may not agree with it, but they would see that as it's not a sort of downgrading. It's simply a move from an HSID to an infectious disease for which you have standard precautions for that level of risk.
Do you think that there was a sufficiently good guidance saying out, notwithstanding that we've had FFP3 as an HSID, the reason we're recommending FRSM in all non-AGP hotspot areas is this? Do you think that that message was sufficiently well communicated to healthcare workers?
I think that, well, I mean, let me just preamble this. You invited me to do so, so I'm going to, by saying that the areas of PPE, it's a highly specialist area. It's not one that I get involved in under ordinary circumstances, nor is it my technical expertise. As you heard discussed yesterday, this has always historically gone through nursing and microbiology, virology groups of experts. That's where it comes from. So I just want to be careful. I don't sound as if I'm trying to be an expert in this area. I'm not. This is not my area of expertise. I think that, and I think this is a recommendation I think the inquiry I would invite the inquiry to consider. I think that the messaging near the beginning of this was quite confused. And I think the reason that it was confused was it was not entirely clear who it was who was ultimately responsible for making decisions in this fast-moving situation. Can I expand? Would you find that helpful for me to expand on that?
Well, I was going to ask you who was responsible. Well,
I think that quite a lot of people thought they were partially responsible, and that's always an extremely difficult and dangerous situation to find yourself in. So it wasn't the people who were trying to walk away from responsibility, but the sort of the quite complex system by which Public Health England, as it then was, the infection control cell, NHS delivery of various things were interacting, and that's before we get into issues of procurement and distribution, which had a separate set of challenges. I think works fine if you're changing every 6 months or so in a reasonably measured way. Up against the speed of changes that were needed, I think it led to uncertainty. It wasn't deliberate in any sense, and it wasn't anybody, as I say, trying to walk away from responsibility, but uncertainty as to who finally was actually trying to both call this and communicate it. And I think that, to me, seems an important thing which the inquiry might want to consider recommending.
So to go back to my question, from your perspective, who was ultimately responsible?
I think that the ultimate, well, my view mechanistically was ultimately the responsibility for decisions was taken by the IPC cell, which became clearer over time, and technical advice to them came through Public Health England, as it then was UKHSA now, with delivery through the NHS. But as I say, I think there was a fair degree of uncertainty, and actually one of the reasons that some of the DCMOs in my team got pulled in was, in my view, because of that uncertainty. And we took a slightly, if no one else knows what, if it's unclear what to do, people would send it to the CMO, tended to be a default for quite a lot of things. But this was not our area of expertise, and that was why I was keen that we didn't get too heavily involved in it.
Right. Caveat understood, but you said there that you think the messaging was quite confusing. For healthcare workers, is that who you mean?
I think for everybody, actually, but obviously the most important people are healthcare workers in the front line who are having to use this.
Right. Now, speaking of potentially confusing messaging, I think you are familiar, Professor, with the tweet that was put out by the World Health Organization. Can we have it up on screen, please? I think it's INQ 300-579. I'll just deal with the tweet, and then I'd like to ask you about your involvement with the WHO. You can see there, this was, I think, tweeted on the 28th of March, so we had gone into lockdown just a few days earlier. Fact, COVID-19 is not airborne. Fact check at the bottom, COVID-19 is not airborne. Did you see this tweet?
Yes, I mean, I saw it subsequently. I didn't see it coming into my inbox, but people drew it to my attention. I was quite surprised by it.
Well, I was going to say, what did you think?
Well, I mean, it was clear that, there was uncertainty in this area. In the UK, we've been discussing the question whether there was any airborne transmission struck us as, well, of course, there's going to be some. But the question was it actually trivial and having almost no impact, or was it a major part or some points between that? But what we were all certain of, and if you read all the correspondence on this, clear from mid-January onwards we were discussing this, was the degree of it. But we all knew that the data were not yet clear enough to make a decision one way or the other. So this seemed surprisingly definitive.
Right. Now, you set out in your statement between January and July 2020, you had 44 meetings of an international nature, 19 of which were WHO meetings. Was this tweet discussed at any of the WHO meetings that you attended?
The tweet specifically was not, and I think it would have been slightly odd for people to do it.
What about the topic?
The general topic was discussed, and this is obviously one of the things that there was a lot of. We were trying internationally to form some form of central view as to what the proportion was. Science is an international issue, and WHO discussions included this, although many other things as well in what we were trying to do.
Right. Did you ever say in any of those meetings, that is not a helpful tweet to have put out? It may be inaccurate for all sorts of reasons. Did you ever take them to task, for want of a better phrase?
I think if I start taking WHO or anyone else to task for all their tweets, that would be a problem in the system. They were well aware of the fact that this had not landed well.
All right. Did you ask them to do anything about it, to retract it, to get your WHO colleagues or CMO colleagues on WHO to join forces to rewrite?
Among the very large number of things I was trying to do at this moment in time, trying to get WHO to retract a past tweet didn't seem to me one of my roles, no.
All right. What about forgetting the tweet itself, but getting WHO to not be as definitive as they were here, given the uncertainty as the extent to which airborne transmission played a part in the spread of COVID?
So I think that what WHO was reasonably reflecting was scepticism of the size of the effect. I think what was wrong about this was the degree of definitiveness that was put into this tweet. But I mean, in defence of WHO, I don't actually think tweeting is a very good medium for trying to put forward really difficult science. And possibly the question is, would it have been sensible not to tweet at all, rather than the exact wording of this particular tweet, on a subject which is so technically difficult and disputed?
That's probably wider than Module 3's remit, but I take your point, Professor. Just while we're dealing with WHO, we heard, is this correct, that guidance from WHO, the UK is not bound to follow it. Is that correct?
No, and absolutely. I mean, it's a multilateral organisation. It's a membership organisation. There is no obligation on the UK or any other country to follow their advice.
Generally dealing with your WHO meetings, were routes of transmission discussed in those meetings?
They were.
And help us, what was the general tenor of the discussion about transmission?
Well, I think that the debates that you've seen laid out in, for example, SAGE papers, where this was debated quite extensively, the EMG group of SAGE, Environmental Modelling Group of SAGE, for example, among them, were reflected in the international literature as well. So these debates were being had everywhere because they had quite profound implications both for control and for clinical management.
You said in your statement you had, I think, 118 international meetings as well between August 2020 and June 2022. Was there anything gleaned from how others were doing it that you found useful to bring back and try and adopt it within the UK or England?
I think it's important to recognise that for large parts of, at least certainly the very beginning of COVID and indeed subsequently at multiple points, either all of our information came internationally or a lot of it came internationally. The science was international, and in the end, the countermeasures, including vaccines, were an international effort. So this was an international effort at all times. Different countries have different capacities. UK, for example, is extremely strong in clinical research. It was very strong on genomics, but there were others who were giving very useful epidemiological information from their experience. So the sharing of information was both normal and was incredibly important in this pandemic.
And was that coming through you, essentially?
No. It came through me, but there were multiple other routes. So people in PHE, for example, would have formal routes, and then UK scientists and clinicians of all sorts have bilateral links with colleagues overseas. And indeed, many of the things I got were an email from someone who I'd been a friend of mine who I taught at some point from another country would email me and say, are you aware of this? And that was extremely helpful as an early warning. Right. But that was happening across the whole system. I wasn't unique in that.
Well, that's what I wanted to check. If you were the central funnel for this repository and we were to sadly lose you, I didn't want anyone to think that we would lose with it the channels of communication. But
that would not make much difference to the UK in that sense.
All right. Can I just deal with your meetings to provide some context for some of the other questions I'm going to ask about what was going on in the pandemic? You had 65 meetings with the Royal Colleges between January and June 2020, 245 meetings with Matt Hancock, not including Cabinet Office or Number 10, 286 meetings between the UK CMOs between January and June 2020. And so I wanted to ask you really what for you was a working day like in January, February, March, April 2020?
Well, I mean, it was very long, but then it was very long for huge numbers of people across the system. But what we were trying to do was both absorb information both internationally and nationally. It was very important to hear what was going on around the country, and you've just heard from Professor Fong why it is so important to get grounded information from around the country, for example, in one particular area. That was replicated across many other areas. Alongside that, there was a large technical effort. Since I was both co-chair of SAGE and head of the chief executive of the National Institute for Health Research, which is the UK's largest funder of practical applied health research from the government, I had a large bit about trying to get the science off the ground, which is an extremely important part of the early part of the work. And there was a lot of interactions with political leaders. I mean, you've talked about the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care. The CMO is the advisor to the UK government, not to the Department of Health and Social Care. And therefore, obviously, that subsequently involved interacting with the Prime Minister and other cabinet ministers, as well as senior officials. But that came at a bit later along the track after January and February.
Well, can I just ask you about that? If you were taking as you are the advisor to the UK government, why was there such a significant amount of interaction with Matt Hancock?
Well, I mean, he was the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care, so in a pandemic, he was obviously the lead cabinet minister, but under the leadership of the Prime Minister, and that would be the normal situation.
All right, so we shouldn't read anything into the amount of communication you had with him or meetings you had with him?
Well, I mean, I think if I hadn't been meeting with him, there would have been a serious problem in the system.
Okay, now you mentioned there research, and I'd like to ask you about that, please, Professor Whitty. I think you set out in your statement that the fact that you were the Chief Scientific Advisor and Head or CEO of the National Institute for Health Research, NIHR, from January 2016, so predating your CMO role, to August 2021. And You say in your statement that one of the good responses to the pandemic was the way that research pivoted to respond to the pandemic. And I'd just like to ask you, please, about what you did during the pandemic built on the NIHR that was already in place.
Well, I think we had a unique advantage in the UK of the existence of the NHS as a single provider, essentially, of health services, and a very strong tradition of doing clinical research and a very strong volunteering spirit from the general public. And I think I'd like to, if I may, just pay enormous tribute to the over 1 million people who volunteered to do studies as part of COVID, and the fact that almost every doctor, every general practice that I was aware of was involved in research over this period. It was an enormous effort. We were able to do this because we have a single system. We had a small number of major funders, ourselves and UKRI, the Medical Research Council, the principal one, and we could therefore make centralised funding decisions. There was a very quick and centralised ethics system that was able to pivot to this, do almost all of its work on this, and we were able to deliver it in the NHS extremely rapidly. And if you look at the speed of stand-up of research in the UK, it was way ahead of virtually every other country in terms of studies that finally got to see the light of day. That came at a price, and the price was that we were extremely ruthless about the number of studies we supported, because we were very determined that we didn't start 100 studies, none of which completed, so we pushed it right down. But there was it was a pretty tough funnel, and we had to switch off large amounts of extremely important research into multiple other diseases to provide the capacity to do this. And it took us quite a long time, I think longer than we expected, to get those back on track. They are now back on track, but it took us probably 2 years to get anywhere near back to where we were pre-pandemic. So I'm not saying this was a cost-free move.
No, why was it that it took longer than you had anticipated to get them back on track?
I think what we had, when we should have anticipated, but it was the reality, is staff had left, people had moved on. The sort of enthusiasm that had got someone halfway through a study had sort of begun to run into the sand. They had to restart up again. So I think it did, I think that the UK's leadership position on this, which I think the whole system should feel very proud, did also mean that we then had a dip, but as I say, we've now recovered. But I don't think anybody going into this should be under any illusions. If you swing all of your research capacity in one direction, there will be a kind of hangover period where you will not be able to do things you otherwise would have wanted to do.
Yeah, and a knock-on effect on the research that you were conducting that may have to be paused. Understood. All right, now I want to ask you about one particular aspect of research, and that is into long COVID, please. And you deal with this in your statement starting at 497. But can I just see if you agree with me about this? By February 2023, the ONS estimated a prevalence of over 2 million people in the UK with long COVID. I dare say it may be higher now in September 2024. And you make the point in your statement that long-term consequences of a virus are not new. Is that correct? All right. Now,
although the scale of this, I think, was not what we'd anticipated.
No, you go on to say that the precise nature and extent of the risks may not be known, but it's fairly uncontroversial that there will be a risk of a long-term consequence.
Yes, and there's one group of risks which are inevitable, and one group of risks which are possible. And the inevitable bit is if people are seriously ill, some people will have long-term disability as a result of that. If you go into ICU, there is a reasonable chance you will have a result of going into ICU which is long-term and potentially permanent. That was unsurprising. So we were not surprised that severely ill people had long-term consequences, although obviously we hoped that would not be the case. On the bit which was much less predictable in terms of its scale was for people who had mild or moderate disease, also had quite profound long-term effects. Now, this is not unknown with other infections. For example, dengue infection is classic on this. Epstein-Barr virus can do it. So this is not unknown, but the great majority of infections, this is quite a rare event. And as the numbers you've given, I think we could debate about what the exact numbers are, but as the numbers you've given have demonstrated, this was not a rare event here. This was something which happened in a large number of people, unfortunately.
It was obvious, though, was it not, certainly by March, that there were people falling severely ill with COVID. One has to think back at images of Italy and our counterparts across Europe. Given that it is inevitable that some people who are severely ill may suffer a long-term consequence, do you think there was strong enough messaging or communication of the long-term risks to the public when we went into lockdown, for example?
I don't think that any different messaging would have led to any different behaviours. I think at the point when we actually started off in COVID, the key, what you don't want to do is overload large numbers of messages which don't lead to a particular change. The key thing we were trying to say is we've really got to stop this epidemic in its tracks to the best of our ability. I don't think there was any evidence that that message wasn't heard loud and clear by the general public, and they acted incredibly responsibly and incredibly quickly as a result of that. Whether adding this component to it would have actually been important, I think is a pretty open question, and I'm not sure I'd be convinced by that.
Of course.
Since it was a speculative.
No, I follow that, but you can't say that it wouldn't have had an impact because we don't know what impact it would have had if it had been given. I'll tell you what I wanted to ask you was, do you think in the event of a future pandemic, you should be warned? Try to keep yourself safe, because if you get it, you might die. If you don't get it, you may still suffer a long-term health consequence. That could be as bad as X. We don't know yet how bad it will be, but why do you think that messaging might not land with the public in the future?
Well, I think there's a thing we definitely should use to bear in mind in the future, and there's something which I'm a bit more cautious about. I worried at the beginning, I still worry actually in retrospect, about did we get the level of concern right? Were we either over-pitching it so that people were incredibly afraid of something where in fact their actuarial risk was low, or were we not pitching it enough and therefore people didn't realise the risk they were walking into? I think that balance is really hard, and arguably some people would say we, if anything, overdid it rather than underdid at the beginning. I'm just saying that there's a range of opinions on that. So I'm not certain that loading an additional risk on would in itself be useful. However, I think that the thing which this firstly blows an absolute hole in, if it need any further, is the arguments of things like the Great Barrington Declaration, that all you need to do is to isolate a few people and everyone else can just carry on with their lives because they're at limited risk. That is obviously not true in this case, and those kind of arguments, I think, are not strong ones to advance in any future pandemic unless you can demonstrate it. And I think we probably should have been swifter off the mark in spotting long COVID as it emerged, although I think we were relatively quick, and it wasn't obvious we could have done something different as a result, because the main thing we could do at the beginning, before we understood it slightly better, was to reduce the amount of COVID. If you don't get COVID, you don't get long COVID.
Given the uncertainty as to whether a new virus might have long-term consequences, how bad those long-term consequences might be, do you think there can ever be a pre-pandemic plan put in place to try and mitigate the risk of long-term consequences?
I don't think in the narrow sense of you can reasonably predict what the long-term consequences will be and then have something ready to go for that situation. What you do need to have is an open mind that this may well happen, and then try and work out what are the skills in the health service that are going to need to be shifted towards this. So, for example, some of the, in my opinion, and I don't think this is controversial, long COVID actually is made up of more than one syndrome. I think probably at least three. And one of them is very specific to COVID for sure. It's not an overlap with other areas. And we didn't have the skills for that, and we had to develop them over a period of time.
Is that what you set out at your paragraph 4/109?
Sorry.
It's all right. It's page 63 of your statement, Professor.
I'll get there eventually, but if you read it out to me, then I can...
Yeah, you say separately there is in some patients an overlap with the post-infectious chronic fatigue syndromes, for example, that which may occur after Epstein-Barr virus or dengue fever. There is certainly another group of symptoms which occur after COVID, which seem relatively specific to this infection and have some similarity with postural orthostatic, I can't say it,
Orthostatic.
Thank you, tachycardia syndrome. Just help. Is that what you were talking about there?
Yes,
in your last
so the
answer?
three which I'm saying, and I think it's probably more than that, and actually maybe then explain why it's important to do this, is a post-severe disease syndrome, variety of ones, a post-infectious chronic fatigue syndrome, which is a very real and very debilitating situation. I used to do clinics where many of the patients I cared for had this from other infections pre-COVID, so I'm well aware of the very profound effects this can have. And then this relatively specific group of symptoms which we hadn't seen previously after other infections. But there may well be other subdivisions within that, and there's probably overlap there. Why I think this is important to differentiate these, if I may just expand that slightly, is that particularly when it comes to treatment, the treatments may well be very different for those different syndromes. And if you lump them together, you may miss a treatment that's highly effective in one but not the others, or start giving treatments which actually have potential side effects that are rather disadvantageous to people who are unlikely to benefit. So working out what the syndromes are is very important for the subsequent management, treatment and hopefully recovery of people who have long COVID.
I'm getting messages about slowing you
Both down, I know. I'm so sorry. It's my fault, Professor. Let me just go back to where I was, which was actually about research into long COVID, please. And can you just, I think, set out in your statement that over £50 million was spent on long COVID research projects. Are you able just to give us a brief summary of the value of what you learned from those research projects, please?
Yeah, so they came in initially in broadly three waves. It's ongoing and there's a large international effort, although the UK has quite a large proportion of the long COVID research at the moment. There was initially even before this, I requested a systematic review to look at what we knew about this, and that was important because it helped inform our understanding, inform clinical management subsequently. I think that was, from memory, that was around about June I asked for that.
2020.
2020, yeah. There was an initial large study which was really looking at people who had severe disease in hospital, so that's an important subset of people who have long COVID. And then there were subsequently two waves of additional studies which were looking both at understanding its biology, because that helps to identify what might be treatment, and trying out some of the early potential treatments that might be useful. We're quite early in our understanding at the moment. I think that we're not yet at the point, in my view, where we can say with confidence, if you have this particular syndrome, here is a treatment that is going to have this particular effect. So, but I think it is absolutely an area we need to continue to do a lot of research in, because there are clearly a lot of people affected and will continue to be. And it may also have a benefits in understanding the long-term effects of other infections, where we have for a long time been, I think, have had really very limited evidence for quite a significant issue.
And is there research that is ongoing in relation to long COVID?
There's a very active long COVID research group led by Professor Kamlesh Kuntu, I think has given evidence, or is going to be giving evidence to this inquiry for other purposes, but many other people are involved in it. And we've also got, obviously, links internationally, as with all science. I helped to broker some of those with Admiral Levine, who's my counterpart in the US, to make sure that, for example, that the US and UK efforts were properly coordinated as an example, because they've put quite a lot of resource into this.
Can I ask you this in relation to long COVID as well? You say you were involved in trying to assess whether data coming from studies implied that countermeasures, and in particular vaccines, reduce the incidence or severity of long COVID. What kind of data were you looking at there?
So this was really trying to look over successive waves and trying to see whether there was either a high incidence, i.e. new cases of people with long COVID post-vaccination, and then if they had COVID, what proportion of those went on to have chronic symptoms, which could be called long COVID. And I'm going to summarise rather crudely, but unsurprisingly, vaccines that protect people from having COVID protect them from getting long COVID, because if you don't get COVID, you don't get long COVID. But I think, importantly, vaccination meant that those people who did get COVID subsequently, it looks as if they get a lower incidence of long COVID and a less severe manifestation. But it's a bit difficult to tease apart because, of course, different waves have had different viruses. And we're now in an Omicron, post-Omicron era, and that is obviously a rather different situation biologically.
I think, you said in the statement that evidence currently available as vaccines reduce both the incidence and the severity of long COVID.
Correct.
In relation to the vaccination messaging, clearly her ladyship has got a module dealing with vaccines, but do you think there ought to have been clearer messaging about the potential positive impact that vaccines could have on long COVID or the long-term consequences of a virus?
Yeah, I think the first thing is that until relatively further down the line, we had much less strong evidence about this than we had for severe disease, and we were obviously pushing a very, very clear series of communications based on the very solid data we had that demonstrated that vaccines reduced very significantly COVID, severe COVID, and death, for which there is absolutely cast iron and early evidence. I think arguably we could have added that in, the point about reducing the risks of long-term sequelae. I think whether that would have changed people's decisions, so those who decided to have a vaccine, or rather those who decided not to have a vaccine, fortunately a relatively small minority, but still an important one, whether they would have changed their minds had that information been available, I think is an unknowable question. Clearly the majority did choose to have a vaccine.
What about the incidence of long COVID in healthcare workers? Can you recall when it was you first became aware that there were healthcare workers who were contracting long COVID?
Almost as soon as I was aware, initially with individual cases of people you just knew, and then increasingly what in medical terms called case series, just a group of people, and then wider studies. But unsurprisingly, healthcare workers had exactly the same risks of long COVID as the general population, similar to them in age, gender, ethnicity, and so on.
Are you aware if there was any monitoring of the numbers of healthcare workers that were suffering with long COVID?
Not that I saw. I had quite a lot of data from, for example, ONS, you've quoted that, and others looking at long COVID in the general population. It's possible that NHSE kept those data. I didn't see them.
Did you yourself provide any advice or support to those that you knew who were suffering from long COVID?
Well, I think all of us, I suspect everybody listening, not just those who have a particular interest in this inquiry, actually, would know people who had long COVID, and all of us therefore interacted with them as friends, as colleagues, as you would hope.
I'm asked to ask you this. Clearly, we are aware of the disproportionate impact that long COVID had on people who are from a black, Asian and minority ethnic background. And I wanted to see if there was any work ongoing to monitor long COVID within that particular group of people.
Yes, ethnicity is one of the things people are looking at in terms of long COVID in research terms.
And do you know yet if there is a link between the disproportionate impact of COVID on the BAME community and the rate at which they contract long COVID?
I think what's not clear, at least in my view, is that the increased rates of COVID in a pre-vaccine era, which are one of the things that was very important in understanding early on, led to an increased rate of long COVID, unsurprisingly, irrespective of anything else, in people from black, Asian and other minority ethnic groups. I think whether they biologically responded differently to long COVID is much less clear, and is it potentially an important point, because it may lead to differences in the way you deal with treatment.
Okay. You said, I think at the beginning, in answer to questions about long COVID, it was important to keep an open mind. I paraphrase perhaps, but can I ask you please, and if we could have a look on screen at 474-233 at 176. This, Professor, is an extract from the inquiry's Every Story Matters record, And there's a chapter in there in relation to long COVID. And in particular, those that were contributing to Every Story Matters have commented that they found it very difficult often when they spoke to their GP or other healthcare services, that at times the GP didn't know how to advise them, didn't know what they were reporting. Can you think of, I can see there, for example, I spoke to my GP at the same time I was in contact with the community mental health. That's where we sort of discussed long COVID because of fatigue issues, but there wasn't a lot available at the time. And I think you've read that section of the record, haven't you, Professor? Thank you.
Do you, the information may not be available, but do you know what the date is that they were talking about?
No, not necessarily.
I mean, the reason I say that is I think that up to and including it's probably November 2020, there was really very little guidance of any sort for GPs and other doctors to know what to do. NICE then produced some guidance, and after that point, I would hope that there was, through a trusted source based on systematic reviews, on the limited information we had, at least we had a starting point to actually help our medical and other healthcare professionals to support people. I would be very disappointed if people didn't take it seriously or did not believe them. I think but I can understand entirely why GPs and other healthcare professionals found, now what do I do, a much harder question until we had systems in place.
Well, if it helps you, although we don't have precise dates for those who are whose quotes are recorded here, if we just look at the opening paragraph and the final sentence, certainly the way this has been summarised is that early in the pandemic, contributors living with long COVID said it was challenging to find any information, advice or treatment, which may chime with the answer that you've just given.
I think that is absolutely, clearly true.
And can you think now of any way we can better advise clinicians in their response to potential long-term impacts?
Well, I think that the first thing that's very important is to hear what people have to say and understand it and believe it as a starting point. I think then the question is, are they people who are going to benefit from relatively specific or more generalised specialist support? For example, long COVID clinics were set up as part of the response. The point we started to, I think, really fully understand what we should be doing from about November 2020, and that expertise now exists, and it's multidisciplinary because there are many different aspects to this. Or there might be someone who had a very specific thing, which might be around physical disabilities or others. And then I think there's also an important point for people to understand that the longer-term outlook for people with long COVID varies very significantly. Some people make a almost or complete recovery relatively soon, as in a matter of weeks to months, having had undoubtedly long COVID as defined by any area, and others have a much longer course or indeed see no improvement. And I think understanding that range is very important, but it needs to be laid out with the strong caveat, as I say, we are in the foothills of our understanding of this important set of syndromes.
Can I turn to shielding, please, and certainly make a start on that topic before perhaps we take our lunchtime break? That is dealt with in your section 9, Professor, of your statement, and you set out there that it was SAGE that recommended shielding of the most at-risk patients in early 2020. And it was the role of your office to lead the development of the definition of both clinically extremely vulnerable and indeed those who are clinically vulnerable. Yep. You have helpfully included a timeline in your statement. I'm not going to go through every entry, but there will be a couple of dates that I'd like to ask you about. But can I deal firstly with clinically extremely vulnerable, yep, and then deal separately with clinically vulnerable? And really the identification of the conditions that gave rise to CEV status. And perhaps if we call up on screen your actual statement, it would be easier to do it that way. And could we have INQ 410-237_86? And there are there, forgive me. Yes, there are set out there from bullet point 1, going all the way through, I think, to 6, organ transplants, people with cancers, people with severe respiratory conditions, people with rare diseases, people on immunosuppression therapies, and people who are pregnant with significant heart disease. And those were the people to whom the letters were sent. Is that correct, in March 2020?
That is correct. Additionally, GPs, general practitioners,
I was going to come on to that.
identified additional cases, but yes.
Yes, so there was the 6 categories, if I may call it that, plus the option for GPs to identify those from their own patient list that they may consider to be clinically extremely vulnerable, and that made up the shielded patient list. Is that correct?
That is correct.
All right. And how was it to have worked out that these were the conditions, plus the GP additions, would be the ones that were deemed to be clinically extremely vulnerable?
So, I mean, there was a kind of, essentially, there were 2 stages of trying to construct a list for the clinically extremely vulnerable. And I think an important preamble to this is that we recognise that being on the clinically extremely vulnerable list and then shielding would be extremely difficult mentally and operationally, and for people who had healthcare conditions, which most of these people had, also in terms of healthcare provision, actually. So there were very significant downsides to it. So we were, on the one hand, if you start with essentially, if you divide into 3 things, the concept of whether shielding was a good idea, whether the lists were sensibly constructed in terms of risk, and the operational elements of was it delivered well. Just taking the issue of the lists, we didn't either want to put people on the list who were going to have limited benefit from it because we thought they would probably come to net harm, nor do we want to have people not on it who we thought would come to net benefit. Unfortunately, at this point, we were, of course, constructing a list based on first principles. So we subsequently, and you may want to come on to this, did a much more evidence-based, in the sense of from COVID evidence, based list, which led to something called Q-COVID, which is a risk stratification.
We will come on to that.
But for this period, we were having to do it on the basis of who would you expect would be most likely to die from this infection. And that's a combination of some early information we had, particularly from Chinese and other scientists, remembering we didn't at this point have a lot of UK data. This is before the wave had passed through, the first wave. And secondly, just what you would normally expect for an infection. Who are the people who are going to find it most difficult to mount an immune response, for example, and therefore be much higher risk. And it was on that basis, it was essentially a consensus statement, which in medical terms is the lowest standard of evidence. And we accepted that. Well, we thought that this was better than no evidence at all. So this is really how this came to be. It was from people from multiple disciplines came together to do this.
Can I ask you, in your witness statement, you set out there are a number of meetings around, I think, the 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th of March, as the shielding programme was getting up and running, and clearly ended up with the categories that we've just looked at. During any of those meetings, was disability as a criteria for shielding discussed?
The whole, I mean, I can't recall absolutely everything that was put as a possibility. Because of the downsides of this, the only groups that we ended up with were ones where we thought there was an overwhelming probability of substantially increased harm. And from first principles at this stage, disability, however defined, would not have been in that group.
We know in due course that Down syndrome was added to the list. Was there any thought given to that specific addition of Down syndrome to the CEV list at the start?
At the beginning, it may have been thought about, but I think we would not have, from first principles, expected to have had the degree of risk that actually transpired. And the reason for doing the work that led to the Q-COVID system was exactly this, which is the first principles can only give you a very first approximation. And what the Q-COVID risk score and the research that led up to it did was much more accurately determine what the risk was. And the reason we we added people who had Down syndrome to this list in advance of the rest of the Q-COVID work was they demonstrated so much higher a risk than you would expect, and importantly, so much higher a risk than the general population, that we thought putting them on early was clinically the right thing to do in advance of other groups.
We will come on to Q-COVID, but just going back to the GPs adding to those that they consider to be clinically extremely vulnerable, what thought was given to the impact on them of actually having to practically go through their patient lists and work that out, given all the other pressures that were on primary care and GPs in particular as at March, April 2020?
Yeah, I mean, can I put on record what a superb job GPs did? I thought they got a lot of flack, entirely unreasonably. They did an incredibly hard job over this period, and we added this to their multiple other things they were having to do at this point. Our view was that, again, there were clearly downsides to asking GPs to do it, which is the one you indicate, which is this is going to produce additional work for people who are already working incredibly hard and in a very stressed system. But we thought that what we had, which was a list of people with a code centrally, was too crude, and GPs know their patients far better. We also said that GPs could remove people from the list as well as add them, so it wasn't just a one-way door. There could be people where they would make the judgment that actually for this person's quality of life this would be entirely the wrong thing to do, and so GPs had the capacity in a sense to say, of course this is what the central data shows, but in fact I know my patients much better, and I've made this judgment based on these broad criteria that were laid out.
Can we look on screen just at a couple of headlines, figures in relation to the shielding list? And could you call up, please, 410-237-80. And here is the timeline that you've helpfully set out. Just pausing there, 18th of March, the UK CMOs agree the criteria as we've just looked at. The letters started going out then shortly thereafter. Shielding was announced by the Secretary of State for Housing, Communities and Local Government on the 22nd of March. We went into lockdown the next day. And you can see that by the 7th of May, if we just scroll down, at that point there were 2.2 million people who were deemed to be CEV. And I won't go through the various additions between the announcement as to shielding and where we got to on the 7th of May. If we go over, please, to the 1st of August, please. The national shielding programme was paused, although shielding did continue in Leicester and Blackburn with Darwin until the 5th of October. Because of persistent high rates of virus in these areas. And could you help us, please, Professor, why was shielding being paused as at the 1st of August of 2020?
As people will probably recall, by this stage, the number of people who were being infected by COVID was way down on what it was on the peak. And we were very conscious of the major downsides for being in strict shielding for people who are living with it. And our judgment at this point was, out with these areas which had persisting very high transmission, that the risks for someone being in shielding with all the mental and other stresses that came with that, by this stage were going to outweigh any possible benefit from an epidemiological point of view. So for that reason, it was paused.
But clearly with the option of keeping it still in areas where there are persistent high rates, as we can see set out there.
Yes, because it's a risk-benefit.
Yeah.
Quite difficult balance.
Yeah. Right. Now I'm going to turn to Q-COVID, and I wonder, my lady, if that's a convenient moment.
Certainly. Obviously, we have a very great deal to get through. I shall return at 1:40. Can I just issue this alert to the call participants to whom I've granted permission to ask questions? I've been looking through them, and a lot of them are actually quite lengthy, and given I'm going to be very strict on timings, no generosity today, I'm afraid, they may wish to try and shorten the questions. I'm not suggesting they don't ask them, but they may wish to try and shorten some of the preambles and the content.
Thank you, my lady.
22.
All rise.